Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
This is our 14th episode on Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter.
Hey, John, how you doing?
Hey, Matt, I'm doing well. My Matt cell is firing.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I don't just have a John cell. I have a John subsystem in my brain.
Oh, damn. You skipped to the next chapter.
Oh! No, well, but we're talking about brains.
Yeah.
But not in like the zombie brain eating way.
Right. Yeah, we're not.
Although he does
brains.
talk about neuron eaters in these chapters.
He also talks about cutting out chunks of brains.
Oh my gosh. This guy, like, they talked about that so, like, sterilely. Is that a word?
Yeah. Clinically, sterilely. Yeah.
Yeah, clinically. That's a perfect word for it. But do you wanna just dive right into that?
Yeah, sure. And this was kind of a theme that within these two chapters, there was this theme of like these grotesque experiments that scientists have run to try to understand the brain a little better. Basically, this guy, Lashley, I think his name was, he was trying to understand the part of a rat's brain that holds the ability to solve a maze.
Yeah.
So if I understood the experiment correctly, he would like have these rats learn this maze, and then he would slowly cut out parts of their brain to see when they stopped being able to solve the maze.
Yeah.
Which just sounds so horrible.
The way that they describe that is he trained rats to run mazes and then removed various cortical regions. No, you chopped out a bit of that mouse's brain. Don't try to hide that under cortical regions, because it makes it sound like, I don't know, it just, clear, sanitizes any sort of like grossness about it.
Yeah. And the worst part about it is he didn't even, he kind of like didn't even really find, actually, he found out something incredibly remarkable, which is that it's not stored in any one part of the brain.
Right. And
the brain is kind of this, he would cut out these various parts of the brain and the rats could still solve the maze, although some of them would take longer. But what that basically means is the knowledge to solve the maze is somehow spread across the entire brain.
Yeah.
Which was the incredible finding that he did come up with.
Right. And that when he removed more, the mouse struggled more with the maze. So it was kind of like, it's just spread everywhere. And Hofstadter makes this joke, which is like, I guess the brain, it's kind of a defensive mechanism, so that like, if your brain gets damaged through fights or through malicious neuroscientists, like, it has a defense against that.
Yeah. Yeah. And this Lashley experiment was pivotal in the world of understanding human brains because, there was all these theories around, and this is what we were talking about in the very beginning of the episode. There was a theory called the grandmother cell theory that I think was sort of meant to be like a ridiculous conjecture. Like, I don't know if it was ever like a serious theory or anything, but the idea is there's some cell in your brain that's like your grandma. And so when you see your grandma or when you think about your grandma, like this cell is kind of firing.
Yeah. No, exactly. And maybe they picked kind of a silly handle for it, but I think it was a real hypothesis that you could isolate that one, neuron or series of neurons that like is where your brain is storing that information. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be like these concepts arise out of all of these. And this is one thing that kind of breaks my brain is like how, like when you think of your grandma, there's neurons like all over your head that are lighting up.
Yeah.
but there's not like it's actually the pattern of neurons that is your grandmother, and not like that there's one specific place where it's, and you've just learned that like, okay, this pattern means grandma, as opposed to like there's one neuron that represents that.
Yeah, and also it's not like, when I say grandma, it's not like you're perfectly imagining an image of your grandma in your mind. You're thinking of like food she made for you. Like my grandma used to make me crepes and blueberry sorbet, so I loved hanging out with her. We also used to play like euchre together. So it's like when you think of your grandma, these dozens and dozens of things, hundreds of things probably, like flit through your mind instantaneously. He mentions this other experiment, this guy Penfield, who, and yeah, this is sticking with the theme of like weird experiments that seem somewhat inhumane, but apparently this guy would just shock random parts of people's brains. And when he did that, they would like see random memories. And it was just kind of this evidence that like information in your brain is sort of stored across your entire brain. So he would shock one part and then you'd see like a memory of your family, and he'd shock another part and you'd see a different memory of your family. And he wasn't finding some clear pattern. It was more just like everything was just spread around everywhere.
But isn't that just, or isn't that what dreams basically are? It's like he was basically simulating a dream.
He was creating dreams, yeah. And they talk about one of the important things about this grandma, like thinking about your grandma, is this notion of funneling, where, and I don't know if I can give a great definition of this, but basically there's some process in your brain where you take the stimulus of hearing the word grandma, bunch of random shit happens in your brain, and the end result is that you experience this chunk of grandma, like you.
Please don't.
All right, that sounded sounded much weirder than I wanted it to, but it's like you experience this kind of like grandma-ness. Your brain, I'm doing a terrible job, but like, because he's talked about this concept of chunking throughout these chapters.
Right, but so if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's kind of like you have this direct neural stimulus, which is like your ear hairs are like your inner ear hairs, not like, the ones that are growing out of them, because I don't want to make you sound older than you actually are. No. But so your inner ear hairs, they're oscillating. And they indicate a frequency. And then your brain has to like pass those jiggling ear hair neurons into this like, okay, well, this is the word grandma. And then like, and he talks about this. Is it going directly from the jiggling ear hair neurons and then like lighting up the grandma, all of the grandma neurons? Or is there like this central place where it's like being translated into the concept of grandma, and then it's kind of like lighting up all the other associations? And I don't think we know, right?
Yeah, I don't think we know, but it did sound like when he was describing funneling, he was describing something more akin to like the latter, or your latter description, where it's like, you hear grandma and then there's some process that takes place in your brain where you're left with this like symbolic representation of your grandma. Right.
And that's arguably the whole core of this chapter is about symbols, and how like, your brain is doing this translation from signals, quote unquote, to symbols.
Exactly.
And that we don't know. We don't know like when does that process, like we're trying to trace it along, and I don't even think today, back then they didn't seem to be able to keep track of that. And even today, I'm not sure that we have a really clear idea of like when do we arrive at a symbol.
Right. Yeah, and I think the theory he's sort of driving towards is our ability to think of things symbolically is a simple consequence of our brains being as complex as they are. because he talks about behaviors, and yeah, let's stick with this like grotesque experiment theme. He talks about these wasps that grab a cricket, paralyze it, take it back to their home, seal it in their home, bury it alive next to a bunch of eggs, wasp baby eggs, and then the eggs hatch and like consume this poor paralyzed cricket who's been sitting there waiting to die, basically. And they talk about this experiment where evidently the wasp takes the cricket back to his nest, and then he goes in order to sort of set it up, and then he comes back out and grabs the cricket and pulls it in. And these scientists were like, and this is kind of funny, but like when the wasp goes in the nest, the scientists would like drag the cricket away, which is just amazing. And then the wasp would go grab the cricket, take it to the nest, go back in the nest, clean it up, basically start this whole process over, like reset the entire process. So grab the cricket, put it at the front doorstep, clean up inside. And the scientists could evidently do this repeatedly. And they were talking about doing it like 40 plus times.
40 times. And the point being that there wasn't this higher concept of why the cricket didn't know, or sorry, the wasp didn't know why it was doing that.
Right.
It just did it, because if it understood why it was doing that, it would, and remembered that it had done that. Yeah. It clearly would not have done it 40 times, but it just had some process. And it's like, well, if the cricket, did I say cricket? If the wasp, if the wasp remembered why it had done it, and that it had done it, yeah, it wouldn't have kept on dragging the cricket to the threshold.
Exactly.
And yeah, but honestly, I feel like sometimes humans do that too, where they don't, they were taught something and they're really not processing why they're, breaking it down into its more component parts.
Right. Cow paths.
They're just following the cow path. And I mean, honestly, sometimes that's the right thing to do, because maybe they don't fully understand why you do something, but then like, it's actually important that they do. So I feel like there's weights on both sides.
Exactly. But yeah. And like you're saying, he mentions that animals generally don't generalize. There's plenty of animals that do extremely complex things, but it's all signal. They haven't reached that point where the signals graduate to symbols. And he mentions how humans have this ability of understanding classes and instances.
Oh, I'm glad you're bringing this up. Yeah.
Yeah, which is funny because that's very much a programming concept. Any programmer, understands classes and instances where you define a class, which is kind of like, the definition of an object, but then you can instantiate individuals of that object. And yeah, he just mentions how humans have the unique ability to, both understand the concept of, say, like a president, but also understand the concept of like Barack Obama, the president,
right?
Which it's like Barack Obama's an instance of the class president.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder, like this, I wonder if classes and instances were already a thing at this point, or is he just influencing all of these downstream programming language because these programming language designers read his book and they're like, oh, those are good names. I'll call this a class and I'll call this an instance,
Dude, it's funny you mention that because literally the next bullet point in my notes after classes and instances was Hofstadter just imagining all these things, or was this known research?
Right.
Because he's just throwing out so many ideas that are like huge ideas, these like utterly like fundamental principles of like all software and, understanding human consciousness, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure he was drawing from like a lot of modern research at the time, but it was 1979. Like this stuff was barely understood.
Yeah. Like, I don't even know. I would need to go back and look, but I mean, C++ didn't exist yet. So it's like, the oldest programming language I know that had the concept of a class didn't exist yet. So I would need to go back and see if this influenced those language designers. And it is funny because like it's just a perfect example of one of those times when I never really thought about the word class before. Oh, it's just, class. That's just the word you use to define, an interface or whatever, or like define a class.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, it's a grouping of things that share attributes.
Yeah, right.
And I don't know, it's just cool to have that, now have that greater realization now after having used them for like 15 years.
Yeah.
But, and then the other cool thing that he says is like, you also can't have you talk about a president, and then you talk about Barack Obama, but like when you have an instance of Barack Obama, that alludes to, the class of presidents, but just the class of men and the class of people. And like, you can't have an instance without also, instantiating a bunch of, or not instantiating, but like kind of bringing to mind
having the qualities.
Additional classes.
Yeah, exactly. And this is this whole symbolic way of thinking where our brains are able to understand like, this is Barack Obama. And then all of these important ideas about Barack Obama, we have access to all of those ideas because our brains are symbolic and can understand these like classes and instances.
And this is what's super powerful about the concept of a class is because like you can imagine like when you're thinking about the class of president, like you can actually divorce it from all of like the specific attributes of Barack Obama. Like it's like it doesn't need to, it doesn't need to be a man. Does it even need to be a person? Like could you have an AI president? Like
dog mayors, there's plenty of dog mayors.
Dog mayor, right? Could there be a dog president?
I wish.
There's no rule that dog can't play president. Sorry, that's like a reference to Air Bud.
Oh,
ain't no rule dog can't play basketball or whatever it is.
Dude, that is a deep, extremely deep cut.
So anyway, but yeah, that's all I'll say about classes. Oh, well, actually, sorry, I did have another point about this, which is like, this is constantly, I feel like listeners may remember I'm going to law school right now. And like, this is constantly what you're doing in law school where you have this general rule and then you read this very specific case and there's this back and forth between cases affecting the rules and rules affecting the cases. So you constantly need to read this very hyper specific series of facts and then like distill it into this abstract class of rules.
Yeah. So your programming background, understanding classes and instances is hopefully going to carry over to law school in some sense.
I think, yeah, in a lot of ways it does, I think.
Nice. Well, the last note I had for this chapter, he talks about, and I did not take very good notes, so I don't know, we can sort of discuss this, but I thought it was an interesting point. Like, humans don't understand physics. Like, it's not like when you see something happen, like if you see a ball roll down a hill or something, it's not like your brain is calculating like, oh, mgh potential energy and then calculating some 1/2 mv squared or whatever. You've just observed that type of thing like a ton of times. And so your brain is able to build this like probabilistic cloud of like what's probably going to happen based on, all these observations. And your brain is basically a big predictive machine where it's just, it's taking in sensory input and it's just kind of predicting what's going to happen next.
Right.
And at some level, that's sort of all it is. And I just wanted to, again, I know I say this so much and I'm probably sounding like a broken record, but that's exactly what ChatGPT is. Yeah. Like it's taking in input and it's predicting the next thing. And a lot of people say like, oh, it's just regurgitating, it's training data. But it's like on some level, that's exactly what the human brain does.
Oh, yeah.
And so I don't think there's as much distinction between what GPT is doing and what our brain is doing than a lot of people realize, or a lot of people think there is.
This ties directly to a section in the last chapter, which it says, like, in quotes, computers can only do what you tell them to do. Like, and he's kind of like calling into question that, like, common, wisdom.
Yeah.
And I think this is exactly what you're saying, where he basically says, as this thing gets more complicated, you're going to be able to predict with worse and worse probability what it is going to do. And now today, you basically can't predict it at all. I mean, we're not quite at the point where it's kind of acting on its own behalf, basically. But I don't know. And like, especially in a world where you have a system that can interact with humans and, like, gather information about that interaction, I still firmly believe it's like, there's your feedback loop. It's just going to evolve.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
So I just don't buy the whole, like, oh, it's just regurgitating, information.
Yeah, neither do I. Well, should we seal off this chapter, or should we try to squeeze in the next chapter?
Let's, okay, there was one other thing. No. Okay, so maybe, there was one other thing that I wanted to talk about. So he talked about neurons and glial cells.
Yeah.
There was this very interesting point that he made, which was like, oh, there's like 10 times as many glial cells as there are neurons, but they just perform the structural function. So we're not going to talk about those.
Yeah.
And that just stood out to me as, like, this feels like one of those times when, we have all this quote unquote junk DNA that, like, doesn't do it, quote unquote, doesn't do anything. And it's like, I just am always very suspicious when things like that happen. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at more into glial cells and if there was anything that we've learned about glial cells since this came out. And they learned something very interesting, which is as a baby, you have a ton of these synapses, like way more synapses than you will have as an adult. And these microglial cells, like, go around and they trim synapses that they will, like, eat synapses, basically.
What?
Yeah. And so that kind of guides how your brain works as you're growing up. And they were saying that people with autism, like, the way their glial cells work is different, and they are not they're not trimming as many synapses as kind of normies.
Wow.
So these glial cells do seem to have this very important function. Now they're not doing the processing themselves as far as we're aware, but they are performing a really important role in cognition because they're kind of like guiding, like, the structure of the network. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's dude, I'm glad you looked that up because I had a similar thought when I read that part.
All right, but so I think that was all I had, but yeah, we're kind of at the end, so maybe we just make it this one chapter, and then we'll have another. We'll wrap up this section with chapter 12.
Hell yeah! All right, cool. Well, I will see you next time, Matt.
See you next time.